The room was dim, lit only by the pale glow of a single lamp and the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock. On the oak table lay a tangle of coloured lines, railway routes, convoy symbols, and pencilled arrows that traced an empire's retreat. 3 German officers, veterans of France, Russia, and North Africa, studied the latest reports from the Western Front. They had once commanded with pride under the Black Cross of the Wehrmacht, but now, in the summer of 1944, their pride was turning to disbelief. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Before them was something that defied their doctrine, their mathematics, even their common sense. "It's impossible," muttered Oberstleutnant Hans Kramer, his finger resting on a notation in the corner of the map. 12,000 tons per day, delivered by trucks. His superior, General der Panzertruppen von Rethberg, leaned forward. The number was circled in red. 500 tons. Each day, American convoys were feeding George S. Patton's Third Army, fueling an advance so relentless that German intelligence suspected deceit. "Propaganda," one of them said, but the figures were not Allied boasts. They came from captured reports, real manifests, real tonnage, real chaos for the German supply staff trying to make sense of it. For 2 decades, German military science had rested on an iron assumption. No army could sustain mobile warfare over more than a few hundred kilometers without rails. That law had defined their own campaigns. The lightning thrust into France in 1940, the march into the Soviet Union. Trains were the arteries of blitzkrieg. Without them, fuel starved the tanks, rations dwindled, and front lines slowed into immobility. Now, the Americans were doing the unthinkable, advancing faster than their railways could follow. And instead of halting, they had invented a new artery. Thousands of trucks, all painted olive drab, were thundering down the dusty roads from Normandy to the front, the Red Ball Express. To German analysts, it was an impossibility. To American drivers, it was just another 20-hour day without sleep. In early August 1944, the German General Staff's Fremde Heere West, Foreign Armies West, compiled a new intelligence report on U.S. logistics. They concluded that, with railheads still in Normandy, the Americans could not possibly sustain more than 0 tons daily beyond the Seine. That meant Patton's army would have to stop within a week, but as the Wehrmacht prepared to strike the immobilized columns, Patton's spearheads were already 70 kilometers beyond the predicted line, moving faster than German dispatch riders could deliver orders. "They must be consuming their reserves," one analyst said. "It cannot last." Yet the momentum did not falter. Fuel, rations, ammunition, everything arrived on time, across roads that German bombers had cratered only days before. The truth was simple, but no one in Berlin believed it. The Americans had replaced the railroad with an idea, and that idea was speed. Across France, an unbroken river of trucks stretched from Cherbourg to Chartres, from the beaches to the front. The drivers called it the Red Ball, named after the red discs that marked the convoy route. 2-lane highways became one-way arteries, guarded by MPs with orders to shoot looters and arrest anyone who slowed traffic. At night, headlights were forbidden, only the faint glow of convoy markers guided the endless line forward. Every truck carried something vital: gasoline in jerrycans, crates of rations, spare parts for tanks, artillery shells, medical supplies. Each driver had a single rule: keep moving. In rain, dust, or darkness, they drove. Tires shredded, engines overheated. Men slept at the wheel and sometimes never woke again. But the convoy rolled on. By late August, over 60 vehicles were operating daily. By September, over 23. The Germans, watching from the shadows, could not understand it. To German logisticians, warfare was geometry, a system of rails, depots, and timetables. Their efficiency was legendary, but their flexibility was brittle. American logistics, by contrast, appeared chaotic, decentralized, improvised, even reckless. But behind that chaos lay something new. A system designed not for order, but for momentum. Captured officers, interrogated months later, admitted their astonishment. "We believed your supply system would collapse," one colonel told his captors. "No army can improvise on such a scale. We thought you were mad." He paused, staring at the map of northern France laid before him. Then he added quietly, "But perhaps madness was what won the war." For the Americans, nothing about the Red Ball Express was orderly. Fuel depots overflowed, bridges collapsed under the weight of traffic, and maps were constantly outdated. Yet somehow the machine ran. 1,000 improvisations kept it alive, tire patches made from ration boxes, engines rebuilt in mud, dispatches scribbled on napkins. Over 75% of the drivers were African-American soldiers, serving in segregated units that were often denied credit for their endurance. They drove the same routes twice a day, sleeping on their trucks, eating cold rations, and enduring the danger of ambushes, accidents, and exhaustion. They had no parades, no medals, and few headlines. But every gallon of gasoline they delivered kept Patton's tanks roaring forward, and every kilometre they covered rewrote the German map of possibility. In September 1944, an intercepted Allied signal confirmed the figure that shattered all prior assumptions. 12,500 tons delivered daily to Patton's Third Army. The report reached the German High Command, where it was quietly filed under unverified. No one could believe it. "A fantasy," one staff officer scoffed. "A misprint. They cannot move that much fuel without railroads." But as Allied armour approached the German frontier, even the skeptics grew silent. In the final report of the Oberkommando der Heere Logistics Division that autumn, one sentence stood out. "The enemy's capacity for motorized supply is beyond calculation." It was not a compliment, it was an obituary. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As autumn rains fell across the shattered roads of France, German convoys shrank into ghost columns, fuel shortages, halting even retreat. Meanwhile, American trucks thundered east, splashing through the mud, unstoppable. The old iron law of logistics, the law that rails defined war, was broken forever, and in its place rose a new creed, written not in textbooks but in diesel and dust. The Red Ball Express had done what the Blitzkrieg once promised. It had made war move faster than thought. In Berlin's dim war rooms, the last analysts stared at their charts, still unable to comprehend the numbers. They had never imagined that trucks, ordinary trucks, could carry the weight of an empire's defeat. They were not generals, nor strategists. They didn't plan offensives or study maps in candlelit rooms. They were truck drivers, ordinary soldiers from towns that most officers had never heard of. Private Henry McGee from Alabama, Sergeant William Howard from Chicago, Corporal Ernest Jenkins from Baltimore. Men who had never seen Europe before the war. Men who had no idea that history would one day call them the lifeline of an army. In the language of supply reports, they were just transport personnel. But in truth, they were the pulse that kept Patton's Third Army alive. They drove, repaired, and refueled day after day, through exhaustion, through fear, through disbelief that any of it was even possible. From the beaches of Normandy to the advancing front, the road was a blur of mud, rain, and dust. Convoy trucks, each marked with a bright red ball, rolled through the night like ghostly serpents. Engines howled, tires hissed on wet pavement. Men sat behind the wheel for 18, sometimes 20 hours straight, eating cold sea rations from tin cans, sipping tepid coffee, smoking until their hands shook. "You didn't dare stop," one driver recalled years later. "You kept your foot down because if you stalled, someone behind you would slam right into your tailgate. There was no stopping the red ball." Military police guarded intersections with drawn pistols to keep traffic flowing. A driver who slowed, risked not just reprimand but chaos for every truck behind him. To keep the column intact, drivers tied flashlights to their tailgates with red filters, forming a dim, continuous river of light that disappeared into the horizon. Nothing about the Red Ball Express was textbook logistics. Depots overflowed, bridges buckled, maps became irrelevant. Officers often had no idea where their trucks were, only that they had to keep moving. A flat tire wasn't a delay. It was a test of survival. Drivers patched rubber with ration box lids, used stolen wire for axles, and poured gasoline straight from barrels to carburetors. "We didn't have engineers," said one sergeant. "We had wrenches and faith." The American genius for improvisation, something German planners once mocked as undisciplined, had become a weapon of war. Out of the WWII, 0 men who drove the Red Ball Express, over 3/4 were African-American soldiers, men serving in segregated transport units, denied combat roles, but given the most brutal workload of any frontline job, they were told they were support. Never been trusted with leadership before the war. Now, they commanded convoys hundreds of vehicles long, navigating combat zones, ambushes, and burning towns under blackout conditions. They were shot at by snipers. They changed tires under artillery fire. They repaired engines with bare hands in freezing rain. We were just tired, but we knew if we quit, the tanks would stop, so we didn't. Their names rarely appeared in war reports. Their units were rarely photographed. But when Patton's tanks broke through to the German border, it was on fuel that they delivered. By September 1944, the Red Ball Express had become a moving city over 900 vehicles covering more than 700 miles of routes. From Normandy's ruined ports to the newly captured depots near Chartres, the convoys never rested. Every 24 hours, the system consumed 0 gallons of gasoline to deliver gasoline. Each truck carried 2.5 tons of supplies. Each round trip could take 48 hours. Each delay could stall an entire corps. And yet, somehow, the system worked. Even General Eisenhower, who had doubted its sustainability, was stunned. He called the operation a miracle of organization and courage. For the men behind the wheel, there was no miracle, just grit, dust, and the constant drone of engines that never cooled. The Germans, though retreating, had not vanished. Their fighter bombers prowled the skies, targeting fuel convoys. Partisan saboteurs mined bridges and crossroads. Every truck that burned meant fewer shells for the artillery, fewer gallons for Patton's tanks. Still, the convoys pressed on. When roads clogged with refugees, MPs cleared them by force. When fuel depots ran dry, drivers siphoned from wrecked vehicles. When the enemy bombed a bridge, engineers built a detour overnight. What the German High Command never realized was that the Red Ball Express wasn't a plan. It was a reaction, kept alive by the willpower of its drivers. To them, every trip was a gamble with exhaustion and death. To history, it became the most successful improvisation in modern warfare. Patton himself rarely saw the men who fueled his advance, but his staff understood the stakes. Without the Red Ball Express, the Third Army would have stopped cold before Metz. In one report, Patton wrote, "My men can fight, but they cannot fight without gasoline." He didn't exaggerate. His tanks burned a gallon of fuel for every half mile. Every artillery barrage, every infantry push, all depended on the invisible river of trucks flowing behind the lines. When reporters later called Patton's thrust across France lightning warfare, the general corrected them. It was gasoline warfare. Lightning doesn't move without fuel. By mid-September, 1944, the Red Ball Express had moved over 412, 0 tons of supplies. That was enough to fill a train of boxcars stretching from Normandy to the German border. German analysts intercepted reports but dismissed them as absurd. They still believed in rails, in depots, in order. What they could not see was that the Americans had turned disorder into momentum. Every truckload that arrived shattered another assumption. Every mile driven without rail support rewrote the rules of logistics. It was not machines that defeated the German system, It was the human will to keep those machines moving. By October, the drivers were breaking down. Sleep deprivation, accidents and mechanical failures mounted. The same men who had kept the lifeline open for months now found themselves haunted by fatigue. "We were ghosts," recalled Private Jenkins. "I'd drive 12 hours, eat a ration, sleep in the cab, and wake up not knowing where I was. The road was my world." Accidents were constant. Convoys collided in the dark. Engines seized. But the line never stopped. The German army was collapsing, but so were the men who had helped crush it. They were not celebrated. Their war was invisible, waged in exhaustion, mud, and fuel fumes. When the Red Ball Express was finally discontinued in November 1944, its trucks had logged over 25 million miles, enough to circle the Earth 1,000 times. It was, by all measures, an impossible achievement. And yet, it happened not through strategy, but through will, through men who refused to stop. In the end, the Germans never fully understood how it worked. Their analysts died believing the numbers were exaggerated, a trick of Allied propaganda. But the truth was simpler and more brutal. The Red Ball Express was proof that modern war was no longer decided by who fired first, but by who moved faster and who refused to stop moving. When the guns fell silent, the convoys disappeared. The men went home, their stories unrecorded, their courage uncelebrated. But the legacy remained. Every modern supply chain, every military operation since 1945 carries the DNA of those convoys of men who turned chaos into power and speed into destiny. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a logistical triumph. It was the moment the United States learned that its greatest weapon wasn't a tank or a plane. It was the ability to move mountains overnight, one truckload at a time. And somewhere, in a forgotten German war room, an officer stared at that number one last time, 500 tons per day, and realized the war had been lost not in battle, but in the math of motion. The war was over, but the numbers still haunted them. In the ruins of a once grand headquarters on the Hohenzollern Dam, a small group of surviving German officers sat before Allied interrogators. They were no longer commanders, only witnesses to their own defeat. On the table lay captured intelligence reports from 1944 stamped geheim, now irrelevant. Charts, tables, and the one figure no one had ever believed: 500 tons per day. Clerical error, admitted Generalleutnant Kurt Bayer. No motorized column could carry that much. We thought your supply officers were lying to their superiors. Across from him, the Allied interviewer said nothing. He only slid a photograph forward endless convoys of trucks along a French highway, bumper to bumper, disappearing into mist. That, he said quietly, wasn't a lie. The general stared at the image for a long time, then whispered, "Then we never had a chance." After the surrender, Allied and German staff officers were ordered to compile comparative studies of logistics. The Germans had excelled in tactics, strategy, and operational art, but their system collapsed whenever railways failed. The Americans, meanwhile, had built a supply organism so vast and adaptive that it defied theory. A British analyst called it organized anarchy. Captured German reports used a different phrase. The enemy's mobility derives from chaos harnessed. That line later became a case study at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. What had once seemed American disorder was now studied as the new doctrine of modern war: flexibility over perfection. When peace returned, the men of the Red Ball Express melted back into obscurity. Many of the black drivers who had carried Patton's fuel returned to a segregated America, to the same discrimination they had left behind. No parades, no medals, no monuments. In some southern towns, their uniforms drew suspicion rather than pride. They had fought for a freedom that still denied them equality. "We could outrun the Germans," said one veteran years later. routes and breakdowns. Each entry was a small miracle written in pencil. By the early 1950s, the new West German Bundeswehr studied the Red Ball Express as a model for mobile supply chains. The irony was sharp. The descendants of the Wehrmacht's logisticians now learned from the very system their fathers had dismissed as impossible. In lectures at Hamburg's military academy, instructors projected Allied photographs convoys stretching across France. Students took notes under titles like Highway Supply Systems, Lessons from 1944. What Germany once mocked had become its template, and so the war's greatest irony was not who won, but how. By learning to make movement itself the weapon, General Eisenhower, years later, described the Red Ball Express in his memoirs with uncharacteristic emotion. No single factor contributed more to the speed of our victory than the courage and ingenuity of those truck drivers. They turned the impossible into routine. He rarely named them, but his praise carried weight. Even in post-war logistics conferences, American officers invoked the operation as the birth of the mobile supply chain. Civilian industries quietly adopted the same logic: highways instead of railways, trucks instead of depots, time instead of stockpiles. The Red Ball had rolled beyond the battlefield into the DNA of modern commerce. 412, 193 tons, delivered in just 82 days. 23. Zero trucks operated continuously, 25 million miles logged. Each statistic told a fragment of the story, but none captured the human endurance behind it. The Germans measured war in kilometers and shells. The Americans had measured it in miles driven without sleep. That difference between arithmetic and stamina was the margin of victory. Before the war, German planners had built their entire military economy around Bahnversorgung supply by rail. They believed that control of rail junctions was control of destiny, but in the age of highways, that doctrine was as obsolete as the cavalry charge. The Red Ball Express was proof that the industrial nation could outpace the tactical genius. In the final Allied logistics report of 1945, one understated sentence sealed the lesson. Motor transport, when applied at continental scale, replaces geography with opportunity. That was the epitaph of Blitzkrieg. By the 1960s, the Red Ball Express lived on mostly in whispers, a name painted on souvenir mugs and half-remembered in veteran reunions. Hollywood tried to retell it once, in bright Technicolor, but the movie left out the mud, the fatigue, the sleepless nights, and almost all of the black soldiers. History simplified what it couldn't romanticize. The truth that America's greatest logistical triumph was powered by men denied equal recognition was harder to celebrate. Yet among the survivors, there remained a quiet pride. They didn't need statues. They had memory. And memory, like gasoline, keeps things moving long after the engine stops. In 1955, a declassified Bundeswehr report revisited the question that had haunted the old staff officers. How did the Americans sustain Patton without rails? Its final paragraph was starkly honest. We underestimated their willingness to trust the individual soldier. We believed discipline resided in control. They proved discipline resides in momentum. Those words marked the end of the old Prussian certainty, the belief that war could be perfectly engineered. The Red Ball Express had shown that victory belonged to those who could adapt faster than they could plan. The last surviving Red Ball driver, interviewed in 1991, was asked if he had known he was part of something historic. He smiled. Historic? No. We were just trying not to fall asleep at the wheel. He paused, then added, but I guess we showed them something that speed isn't about engines. It's about never quitting. And somewhere in an archive, still preserved on brittle paper, sits that same figure once dismissed as fantasy, 12,500 tons per day. It's more than a statistic. It's the sound of an army moving faster than belief, and of a world learning that power, once measured in steel and bullets, could also be measured in fuel, tires, and the human will to keep going. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the engines of the Red Ball Express idled for the last time. For the men who had driven those overloaded trucks from Normandy to the Rhine, the silence was almost unnatural. For months, they had lived by the rhythm of roaring engines, squealing brakes, and shouted orders echoing through fog and dust. Now there was only stillness and the haunting realization that their story, like so many logistical miracles, would fade behind the louder legends of tanks and generals. In September 1944, at the operation's height, the Red Ball Express had run day and night without pause. Over 60 trucks thundered along a one-way loop from the beaches of Normandy to the forward depots feeding General Patton's Third Army. Drivers slept sitting up, ate cold rations behind the wheel, and measured their world in gasoline fumes and miles per hour. They were mostly young, mostly black, and mostly invisible to the public eye. When victory came, the men expected recognition equal to their effort. Instead, most convoys were quietly disbanded. Within weeks, the great supply line that had delivered 12,500 tons a day, an industrial river flowing on wheels, was gone. No medals, no parades, just paperwork and reassignment. Captured German officers would later study Allied reports with disbelief. To them, logistics was the science of railroads and depots, not truck convoys tearing across ruined French roads. They had assumed the Allied advance would stall for lack of fuel long before reaching the German frontier. What they failed to grasp was that the United States had turned its automotive industry into a weapon of movement. Every truck on the Red Ball Express was a fragment of Detroit's industrial heart, rubber, steel, and gasoline fused into velocity. In debriefings, after the war, German quartermasters admitted that by September 1944, they were fighting an enemy whose supply capabilities defied reason. The Reich could no longer keep pace. Their trains were bombed, their depots destroyed, their fuel dwindling to a trickle. Meanwhile, Patton's spearheads seemed to draw power from an endless reservoir of motion. The Germans were facing not merely an army but an entire economy on wheels. Among the 23 drivers of the Red Ball Express, about 75% were African-American soldiers. In an army still segregated by law, they served in logistics rather than combat. Yet they endured dangers equal to any front line. German aircraft strafed the roads, mines littered the shoulders. Fatigue killed nearly as many men as enemy fire. Convoy discipline was everything. One truck stalled, and the entire column risked exposure. Private James R. Anderson, a driver from Georgia, later recalled, "We were told the whole army would stop moving if we stopped moving." That truth gave them pride but also unbearable pressure. Every breakdown, every burst tire, every misstep could delay an offensive measured in minutes and miles. They were invisible heroes, anonymous wheels turning under the machinery of victory. Yet without them, the Allies' pursuit across France would have ground to a halt long before the Siegfried Line. The Red Ball Express was more than trucks. It was a philosophy. The planners at Supreme Headquarters understood that speed itself was a weapon. Every hour saved in transit meant another opportunity for surprise, another kilometre gained before the enemy could dig in. The concept anticipated the mobility doctrines that would define warfare for decades. When historians speak of Patton's audacity, they often forget the logistical audacity behind it. Fuel, food, and ammunition did not magically appear at the front. They were delivered by men who turned mud roads into lifelines. The Red Ball Express taught the U.S. Army a lesson that would shape every campaign to follow. Logistics is strategy in motion. Speed has a price. During its 82 days of operation, accidents killed or injured hundreds. Convoy trucks collided in darkness, rolled down embankments, or exploded when a single spark touched spilled gasoline. Fatigue was relentless. Drivers took benzodrine pills to stay awake, a practice the army quietly tolerated. By the time the system was shut down in November 1944, many men were physically broken, their nerves shredded by sleeplessness. Yet the sense of purpose remained. One veteran summarized it decades later. "We were tired, but we knew we were making history, even if nobody else did." That mix of exhaustion and pride would become a defining memory for the surviving drivers, most of whom returned home to a country that scarcely mentioned their contribution. Peace brought demobilization. The trucks were sold, scrapped, or repurposed. Men returned to civilian life, carrying with them the habit of relentless movement. For black veterans, the irony was sharp. They had delivered freedom across Europe but came home to segregation in America. Still, their wartime discipline found new outlets. Some became long-haul truckers in the booming post-war economy. Others joined the nascent civil rights movement. They knew what teamwork under pressure looked like. They had lived integration by necessity even in a segregated army, and they understood how competence could shatter prejudice. The Red Ball Express thus became an unspoken seed of change. Its veterans carried the proof that performance mattered more than color, and that collective effort could overcome systemic limits. The logistical lessons of 1944 did not vanish. As the United States rearmed for the Cold War, Army planners dissected the Red Ball's structure. They translated its improvised efficiency into doctrine, standardized containers, modular depots, and flexible supply routes. When NATO formed, these ideas became the backbone of its mobility strategy. The Berlin airlift of 1948 echoed the same logic: continuous, overlapping cycles of delivery that never stopped. What had once been trucks on French roads became aircraft crossing blockaded skies. The principle was identical: momentum equals survival. By the 1950, the U.S. Army Transportation Corps proudly traced its lineage to the Red Ball Express. Training manuals quoted its statistics as proof that ingenuity could replace infrastructure. In an era of nuclear strategy and jet engines, a wartime convoy of trucks still served as the model of logistical genius. Civil engineers, too, studied the wartime routes. The narrow French roads that had choked the convoys inspired a broader vision. Permanent highways, capable of sustaining military and civilian traffic alike. In 1956, President Dwight Eisenhower, who had witnessed the Red Ball's chaos firsthand, signed the Federal Aid Highway Act. He described it as both an economic investment and a national defense necessity. Thus, in a quiet twist of history, the rutted roads of Normandy became the conceptual ancestors of the U.S. interstate highway system. The logistical lifeline that had fed Patton's army now fed America's post-war expansion. For decades, the Red Ball Express barely appeared in textbooks. Combat heroes were easier to celebrate. Supply drivers did not fit the romantic image of war. It took historians in the 1970s and 1980s to resurrect the story, combing archives for rosters and photographs. When documentaries finally aired, many surviving veterans wept. They had waited 30 years to hear their own names spoken aloud. The rediscovery coincided with a broader cultural reckoning. As America revisited its civil rights past, the contributions of black soldiers gained new attention. The Red Ball Express became a symbol of both achievement and neglect, a proof that courage behind the lines could be as vital as courage under fire. Military academies now teach the Red Ball Express as a case study in adaptive logistics. Its improvisation, redundancy, and human endurance remain unmatched. Modern operations from the Persian Gulf to humanitarian relief efforts trace their supply philosophies back to that improvised network of 1944. But the deeper lesson is human. When systems fail, when plans collapse under the weight of reality, success depends on ordinary people willing to act with extraordinary speed. That was the secret of the Red Ball Express, not technology or rank, but determination multiplied by motion. In France today, fragments of the old route still exist. Some towns maintain small plaques, Route du Red Ball Express. Rusting signposts stand at odd angles, their red circles faded by rain. Local historians occasionally organize commemorations, reenacting convoys with restored trucks. To passing motorists, they are curiosities. To the few remaining veterans, they are ghosts made visible. Private Anderson, the Georgia driver, visited such a ceremony in 1994. Standing beside a rebuilt GMC Deuce and a half, he said softly, "I drove this road at night with no headlights. Now it's quiet. I can finally see where I was." He was 72 years old then, wearing his original service jacket. The crowd applauded, not knowing how to bridge the distance between history and memory. The ultimate irony of the Red Ball Express is that the Germans were right by their own logic. Such an operation should have been impossible. No nation in history had moved an army so fast, so far, with so little infrastructure. And yet the impossible had become routine, because necessity had erased the boundary between planning and improvisation. Every truck was an act of defiance against immobility. Every driver was a fragment of a larger will, the belief that movement itself could be victory. In that sense, the Red Ball Express was not merely a supply line, it was the physical embodiment of Allied determination, the momentum of freedom given mechanical form. 12,500 tons daily is a statistic repeated in textbooks, but numbers conceal the texture of effort. Behind each ton were faces, voices, laughter, arguments over coffee, the stench of fuel on uniforms, and the rhythmic clatter of tires over bombed bridges. It was the sound of a civilization learning to move faster than destruction. That capacity to improvise under pressure, to coordinate chaos into order, would define the American century. Factories that had built tanks and trucks would later build cars and highways. The same energy that carried supplies to Patton would carry families across interstates, linking coasts and reshaping geography. The road from Normandy led not only to victory, but to a new understanding of motion as destiny. If one stands on a quiet stretch of road near Saint-Lô at dusk, the wind still carries faint echoes. The growl of engines, the grind of gears, the shouted curses in English slang half buried by time. It is imagination, of course, but imagination built on memory. Somewhere in that twilight lies the truth of the Red Ball Express. 1,000 anonymous journeys that, together, altered the outcome of a world war. The German officers who once scorned the idea of truck-borne supply could never have envisioned this, the transformation of logistics into legend. Their defeat was not merely tactical but conceptual. They lost to an idea of speed larger than battle itself. Engines start, headlights flash, and the convoy stretches into the night, a ribbon of determination vanishing toward history's horizon. The Red Ball Express rolls on, forever moving, forever unsung, forever the artery of victory. The story of the Red Ball Express did not end on the battle-scarred roads of 1944. It lived quietly inside every veteran who had once clutched a steering wheel through rain, shellfire, and exhaustion. To them, movement itself had become a creed. Wherever they went, after the war factories, farms, classrooms, highways, they carried that rhythm. Keep it moving, don't stop. The line must hold. In 1945, America was a country in transition, shifting from the urgency of war to the promise of peace. The men who had kept Patton supplied were suddenly civilians again, scattered from Harlem to Houston, from Detroit to Los Angeles. Many found work driving long-haul routes or building the new roads that spread like arteries across the continent. They recognized the shape of the nation's new obsession speed and understood it instinctively. The same logistics that had conquered Europe would now knit together a peacetime empire of commerce and travel. Factories retooled from tanks to trucks, families purchased automobiles in record numbers, gas stations appeared on every highway like modern waypoints of the Red Ball Express. America had learned that freedom could be measured in miles per hour. The line that once delivered ammunition now delivered prosperity. Military historians often credit generals for victory, yet the veterans of the Red Ball knew better. They had witnessed how command orders were powerless without gasoline in the tanks. A colonel could plan a breakthrough, but a private with a wrench or a steering wheel turned that plan into reality. When the army analyzed post-war reports, they discovered that the efficiency of the Red Ball convoys exceeded every expectation, delivery accuracy above 95%, despite chaos, fatigue, and enemy attack. That statistic astonished analysts. It meant that ordinary mechanics and drivers had achieved logistical precision rivaling an entire railway network. Some officers proposed permanent trucking divisions within the army. Others argued that automation would soon replace men. Neither prediction proved true. Technology advanced, but the human factor, initiative, improvisation, and courage remained irreplaceable. The Red Ball Express had shown that war was ultimately won not by machines, but by the people who kept them moving. For the black soldiers who formed the backbone of the convoys, recognition came slowly. In the segregated America of 1945, their heroism was inconvenient to remember. Official photographs cropped them from group portraits. Newspaper stories mentioned truck drivers without names. Yet inside veterans' halls and church basements, they told the stories to one another, the night convoys through fog, the laughter in foxholes, the pride of being indispensable. By the 1960s, as the civil rights movement gained strength, younger activists discovered those forgotten veterans. The parallels were striking: the discipline of organization, the endurance against hostility, the belief that progress required motion. Some of the same men who had driven for Patton marched for equality in Selma and Washington. Their wartime motto, "Keep 'em rolling," became a metaphor for social momentum. The U.S. Army finally recognized their contribution decades later. In 1992, surviving members of the Red Ball Express received a formal commendation. For many, it was a bittersweet ceremony, honor delayed too long, but it restored a measure of dignity to thousands whose sweat had fueled victory. Modern military planners study the Red Ball Express not out of nostalgia, but necessity. In every conflict since, from Korea to Afghanistan, the same principle applies. Logistics determines endurance. Technology can shrink distance, but only human coordination conquers it. Satellite navigation and computerized tracking may map every route. Yet when terrain collapses, when signals fail, success still depends on people willing to improvise. The Red Ball veterans would have understood that instantly. They had navigated by instinct, stars, and broken signposts. They would have laughed at the idea of waiting for perfect conditions. Their creed was simple: move, no matter what. This doctrine echoes in humanitarian missions as well. When earthquakes strike or epidemics spread, relief convoys follow the same unbroken logic. Continuous motion saves lives. Each truck today, painted with UN markings or Red Cross emblems, carries a lineage that runs straight back to Normandy. Across France, the memory of the Red Ball Express has deepened with time. Small museums near Avranches and Chartres display rusted helmets, convoy signs, and faded photographs of smiling young Americans. Local residents maintain memorial stones along former routes. To them, the convoys were liberation in motion, proof that help could arrive despite bombs and ruins. Each summer, enthusiasts drive restored GMCs along segments of the old line, engines rumbling like distant echoes. When the veterans are too frail to attend, their children ride in their place, carrying placards with names and service numbers. The French word souvenir means both memory and reminder. Those parades remind Europe that freedom was not only fought, for it was delivered, mile by mile, by men who refused to stop. Time, however, moves in one direction. By the early 21st century, few original drivers remained alive. At reunions, rows of wheelchairs replaced the lines of trucks, yet even as voices weakened, the rhythm of their stories stayed strong. The sound of engines in darkness, the glare of tracer fire, the endless roads stretching toward victory. When Private Anderson, the Georgia driver who once spoke beside a restored truck in 1994, passed away in 2007, his family placed a small brass plaque on his grave. It read simply, "Red Ball Express, he kept it moving." That phrase, stripped of glory or rank, captured an entire generation's essence. The Red Ball Express was never just a convoy, it was a statement about what coordination and belief can accomplish under pressure. Its legacy transcends geography and color, echoing wherever people must organize motion against obstacles. It proved that greatness can be built from ordinary acts, repeated relentlessly. When historians describe the arsenal of democracy, they often list weapons Shermans, Mustangs, Liberty ships. But the real arsenal was momentum, an entire society synchronized toward movement. Trucks, trains, ships, and workers formed a single organism of purpose. That spirit of collective acceleration became the blueprint of the modern world. Today, satellites track supply chains that circle the globe in real time. Cargo containers glide from ocean ports to inland hubs along highways once imagined by Eisenhower. Every digital order, every overnight delivery, carries a faint echo of the Red Ball Express. It reminds us that logistics, the art of turning distance into possibility, is not a mechanical process, but a human triumph. If you listen closely on an empty interstate at night, when the tires hum and the horizon shimmers with faint light, you can almost hear them, the unseen drivers of 1944. Their engines merge with the wind, their determination fused into the concrete beneath. They are part of the road now, anonymous yet eternal, still keeping the world in motion. And somewhere, beyond time and distance, the convoy continues. Headlights stretch into the dark, a river of endurance flowing endlessly forward. The Red Ball Express rolls again, unchained from war, powered by memory and carrying the everlasting lesson that movement itself can be victory. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.